I'm John Rodgers from Cuyahoga Falls, and we're doing another one in my series of the Men of Rushmore. And this one, as you can see, is Thomas Jefferson, father of American democracy. Thomas Jefferson was the foremost spokesman for the democratic ideal for the common man, yet he possessed slaves during the whole of his adult life. He was an excellent architect, and at an early age built his masterpiece, Monticello, in Virginia, and then proceeded to remodel it for 47 years. He was very nearly a model of fiscal responsibility in government, including retiring of 1/3 of the national debt, but he left such a trail of debts at Monticello that it had to be sold after he died to settle some of them. Thomas Jefferson disliked the legal profession, but became the best prepared lawyer in all of the colonies and excelled at the job. He disliked politics, but served with distinction in that field for 40 years. He was all of these things and much more, and we probably owe more to him than to any other leader that this country has known. No other, including the other three on Mount Rushmore, has brought to the presidency the knowledge, the broad perspective, or the deep, abiding faith in the common man that Mr. Jefferson did. In the White House, John Kennedy once said to a group of 16 Nobel Prize winners, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with a possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." Thomas Jefferson was born April 13th, 1743, and raised in the beautiful hills of Albemarle County, Virginia, at Shadwell Plantation on the Ravenna River, only about 3 miles from the present location of Charlottesville. The house is no longer there, but there you can see the hill with its trees. In Shadwell, from Shadwell you could see the present-day Monticello. And here is that Ravenna River that I spoke of in the background in a shot taken from Monticello. He learned to shoot and ride horses. He canoed on the Ravenna River. He met many interesting people, including Indians who stopped at Shadwell since it was very close to a major east-west route. He studied Latin, Greek, and French. He became an accomplished violinist, but he also learned most of the trees and plants of central Virginia. From his father, he inherited approximately 5,000 acres, and from his mother, a Randolph, he inherited high social status. However, his papers say almost nothing about his mother, while speaking often about his father's size, influence, abilities, and knowledge. And that's some of the land right at Monticello. In March of 1760, Thomas Jefferson traveled eastward to Williamsburg, capital of the Virginia colony, to enter the College of William and Mary, which you are looking at. He was an excellent student, a quality retained all of his life. At William and Mary, they had only 3 buildings. He mastered physics and calculus and other subjects dealing with arts, sciences, and moral philosophies. He graduated in 1762. One of the men that Jefferson met and admired during his Williamsburg days was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was a fiery orator, and perhaps this was one of the reasons for the admiration. There was no indication at that time that he would later be a very active enemy. Jefferson stayed on in Williamsburg and studied law under his friend George Wythe. He completed his studies and became a lawyer in 1767, 5 years after he started. And that was after he finished the College of William and Mary. He was probably the best prepared lawyer in the colonies. And in parentheses, by contrast, Patrick Henry studied law for only a few months before starting his practice. During his days at Williamsburg, both at William and Mary and while studying law, Three minds bestowed an incredible diversity of thought and knowledge on Thomas Jefferson. Incidentally, that is the Raleigh Tavern at Williamsburg. These three powerful influences were George Wyeth, and he lived in this home, his friend and law instructor, William Small, his math instructor at William and Mary, and the British governor, Francis Farquhar. These were times of good talk, good food, good wine, and good music. In Jefferson's words, from these men he heard more good sense, more rational and philosophical conversations than in all my life besides. That's the capital at Williamsburg. When you walk around Williamsburg, remember at least these homes and places of business that influenced Jefferson. The Wyeth House here, the Raleigh Tavern, and especially this room, the Apollo room in it, and then the Royal Governor's Palace. And that palace served as the executive mansion after the British fled. You might also remember Carter's Grove, a tidewater plantation close by. Because it was during these days, and especially in matters dealing with conditions leading up to the American Revolution, that Jefferson first learned of the vast difference between the tidewater establishment and the Piedmont and mountain country's independent spirit. He also mastered the art of negotiation and maneuvering when dealing with complex issues and complex people. Jefferson became a very successful lawyer and was also elected to the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses, in 1762. During this period, before 1776, his most noteworthy political work was a summary view of the rights of British America. It was written in 1774 and held that allegiance was owed only to the king and that Parliament had no control over the American colonies. It further stated that tyrannical acts by the king would forfeit that allegiance. And it also stated that the God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. Very strong words. Although he was a successful lawyer, he regarded that work without the love that he showered on learning and later on the building and operation of Monticello. He had started work on a cottage at Monticello, that's Little Mountain in Italian, and when the home at Shadwell Plantation burned in 1770, the family moved into what he had so far. During this period, Jefferson prepared many drawings for a great mansion at Monticello. Since all of his books were lost in the fire, he spent much of his income on new ones and soon had over 1,000 volumes. Now, it's really hard to find anything dealing with Martha Skelton as far as no photography, of course, but paintings and the like. This is the best I could do, a silhouette. In the same year that Shadwell burned, he met Martha Wales Skelton, a young widow who had returned to her family home near Williamsburg. They were married on New Year's Day in 1772 and started back to Monticello, arriving in a snowstorm the next night. In small groups, his conversation was deep, penetrating, and enjoyable, and his pen was masterful, but the art of public speaking never became one of his possessions. His ability to express himself in writing basis from reading, study, and his own writing and experience. He was an advocate as a pioneer of individual freedom, and he knew the law, and he had been elected to the Continental Congress. Thus, he was an excellent choice to write the Declaration of Independence. In the year 1776 in Philadelphia, in what we now call Independence Hall, after much talk and debate in which he did not participate, Thomas Jefferson put into written words the thoughts that were being expressed. This is the inside of Independence Hall, and this is the room where much of the debate took place. But Jefferson did the writing over in this place, Graff House, just off Independence Square, about a block or so. Now, this is a construction, but you must remember that in that very same space, Jefferson did this writing. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. This is his first, not his first draft, but one of the drafts. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is a facsimile. You can go and see the original in this building, and I have done so in Washington. But believe me, there's not much left on it to read. So when I'm photographing, I usually use a facsimile, although I have my own photographs of the original. Now, following that, in the Declaration of Independence is a list of the reasons for having a government that is directed towards and is responsible to the common man. Then these sentences introduce the next section. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And I want to correct a little misconception on this. I have seen this picture in print as the signing of the Declaration. This is not the signing of the Declaration. This picture is taken in the rotunda of the Capitol in Washington. It is the presentation by the committee. Of course, Jefferson was the big part of the committee, to the whole group of the Declaration. The signing came later on after the arguing about it. Then follows a long list of grievances, a recap of the ways that had been used to inform the British of those grievances, and a declaration that the United States is no longer subject to the British crowns. And this is the Liberty Bell that was used to celebrate and announce that the signing had taken place. And then Thomas Jefferson wrote a closing sentence that required great courage of the people who would later sign it. Quote, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." But the words which strongly condemn King George III as to slave trade and would have served to abolish slavery in the United States were deleted from heated debate. That issue would be faced at a later time by the country and another of the mighty men of Mount Rushmore. I held it on this picture. This is slave trade as depicted in the museum at the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. And here is the man who would later face that issue. Somehow in these days between 1776 and 1779, Thomas Jefferson worked for free education, for outlawing the importation of slaves into Virginia, and for abolishing the law that required inheritance to go to the oldest male. And it was during this period that he authored the Statute of Virginia for religious freedoms. And this was the real separation of church and state, because it stopped in Virginia government support of a particular denomination. The reason I wanted to use a church, and I used this particular church in Richmond, Virginia, because this is a church in which Patrick Henry had gave the speech on "Give me liberty, give me death." Thomas Jefferson suffered intensely during the Revolutionary War years. He was governor of Virginia at a time when no one could have done a decent job of governing. Indeed, it was probably the lowest point of his life as a public servant. Virginia was unprotected because many Virginia troops had been captured in the Carolinas, and George Washington had none to send. The British ran roughshod over the state, even into the hill country. This is the capital at Richmond that you're looking at, and here is another view of it. Richmond, which had become the capital only in 1779, was vacated by the government in 1781. The Capitol, which you see today, was designed by Jefferson in 1785, the building that you're looking at. Jefferson abandoned Monticello at the last possible moment when Tarleton's cavalry arrived on the scene. Tarleton was the man who was defeated by the colonists at Cowpens, South Carolina, in the Revolutionary War, and turned the tide, one of the battles that turned the tide. Jefferson was later called a coward because he had fled from the British. He finally resigned before his term was finished, and then his beloved wife Martha died. Now, on a lighter note, in 1783, Thomas Jefferson had kind words to say about a site at Harper's Ferry. That's where Maryland, West Virginia, and Virginia come together. A rock there still carries his name because he praised the view, the joining of the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers, and said that it was one of the most stupendous scenes in nature, worth a voyage across the Atlantic. In the moment of their junction, they rushed together against the mountain, rend it asunder, and pass off to the sea. And I hiked quite a bit to get to the point where I could take that picture, and that is Harper's Ferry that you see down below, and just a little bit more history that would come along later on. It was right down in this area where John Brown was captured when he was trying to raid the federal arsenal there. Thomas Jefferson, in his 1784 reports on the government of the Western lands, provided that when population was sufficient, the states would enter the Union as co-equals with the original 13 colonies. He also stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude should be allowed in the West. This last idea was rejected by Congress, but the Northwest Ordinance, which came out of Jefferson's reports, restored Thomas Jefferson's clause in 1787, and Ohio is part of the Northwest Ordinance. Jefferson kept notes on all manner of things. The weather, including temperature, dates of blooming of various plants, especially at Monticello, and his farm book is a bounty of information about the activities at Monticello. Now, he went to France as minister, and in Paris he finally came upon better times. This is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. He was in Paris during the storming of the Bastille and encouraged the French Revolution. And this is the Louvre, or Louvre, depending on how you pronounce it. And this is the palace at Versailles. Those three pictures are the ones I chose, and one more to go, because Jefferson would have seen them exactly as you're seeing them, and I saw them. He liked many things about Europe and sent back a steady stream of information about steam-powered mills, about the canals, and that was sent to George Washington, and about musket manufacturing. He sent back many objects and seeds of all kind. And I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this. It's Place de la Concorde, and this is where Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were guillotined, as were a lot of other people. This was a real bloody square, or whatever they call it there. He was vitally interested in painters and sculptors, and one in particular named Marie Causeway, with whom he exchanged letters after his return to Virginia. But even with his good times in France, home was often on his mind. I am as happy nowhere else and in no other society, and all my wishes end where I hope my days will end, at Monticello. Jefferson was sent a copy of the new Constitution of the United States in 1787. He wrote to James Madison, a friend and a Virginia delegate to the Continental Congress, urging that a Bill of Rights be quickly added. His words were, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inferences. Finally, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were passed in 1791. Here's a sort of a local map. Out here is Jefferson's birthplace. This is the city of Charlottesville. Here's Monticello. And here's Ashland, where James Monroe lived. And I think Jefferson designed Monroe's house. And then the arrow here is pointing to the University of Virginia. And in the closing part of this presentation, you will hear some more about the University of Virginia. You can also see the Ravenna River running through here and how close it came to Shadwell, where he was born. While he was in France, his book entitled Notes on Virginia was printed. This is a massive amount of information on many aspects of the state, from natural features and boundaries to politics. And the research had been extensive. The book had been written in 1781 and 1782 and contained items for which Jefferson was criticized. An example, in every country and every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. This particular item was used by enemies to say that he did not believe in God. Another line of note was, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just." This statue that I've shown you a couple of times is the one in the museum right under the arch in St. Louis. Thomas Jefferson at one time in his life did state, however, "To the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the genuine precepts of Jesus himself. I am a Christian in the only sense in which he wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others, ascribing to himself every human excellence, and believing he never claimed any other." Now, besides those words which were deleted from Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, in talking about him, the subject of slavery must be raised. And the subject is perhaps the greatest contradiction in his life. He was still a young man when he inherited slaves. His marriage brought more slaves, and he owned slaves for the rest of his life, as many as 200. And this was one of them. This is Isaac. James Callender, once a friend, was the one that first printed in the Richmond Recorder the story about a more intimate relationship between Thomas Jefferson and a slave. Quote, "It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor keeps, and for many years has kept as his concubine, one of his slaves. Her name is Sally." I'm going to hold you on the words right there. I want to tell you something about this. This is a bill of sales for slaves. And something like that, a paper like that, and a slave medal or identification with a number like this hanging around the neck of a person, those two items would enslave a person. Now, the slave woman about whom Callender spoke was Sally Hemings. Sally was a half-sister to Jefferson's wife, who had died. Sally went as maid with the second of Thomas Jefferson's daughters to Paris when he was serving as minister to France. So Sally had gotten out of the country. She could have stayed in France and would have been free. Here's another thing I want to call your attention to. This is a Columbia, South Carolina newspaper for 1864, I believe it was, in which runaway slave ads are on there. And if I went down even further, you would see reward for getting a cow back and so forth. And then here is slaves that are for sale. Thomas Jefferson really wanted to reform or abolish slavery, at least in Virginia. But he did not offer his plan for gradual emancipation of the 300,000 slaves in Virginia because, his quote, "the public mind would not yet bear," end. He did not free his slaves. Virginia law required that a freed slave must be out of the state within a year, and that caused grave concern for Jefferson. He really wasn't sure that they could manage on their own. He is thought to be the mind behind the 1778 law stopping the African slave trade in Virginia. His attempt to prohibit slavery in future states failed by a single vote, but his wishes along those lines were later carried through in the Great Northwest Ordinance, and I had mentioned that before. Monticello, how harsh it sounds to hear people call it a house. Monticello to Thomas Jefferson was a home, a refuge, an ongoing architectural experiment, a scientific observatory, a library, and a place where his dreams always seemed to end. Now, some of these pictures here on the inside are taken from magazines and maybe American Heritage and so forth, because you're not allowed to photograph inside Monticello, at least not as a tourist, which I was. Today it is a place of history, but if you can find a quiet spot, if you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt myself right there and go back. I want to point out something that always intrigued me. Right above the Lady Guide, this and this were brought back to Jefferson by Lewis and Clark from that expedition. Today it is a place of history, but if you can find a quiet spot, perhaps in an off-season, and let your mind relax, you can sense his presence. You can see and feel many of Jefferson's multifaceted planes of being: inventor, architect, student, gardener, farmer, thinker. Thomas Jefferson left his stamp on this hallowed ground. Mr. Jefferson really loved his gardens and plants and said so. No occupation is so delightful to me as the culture of the earth, and no culture comparable to the garden. Further, and our own dear Monticello, where has nature spread so rich a mantle under the eye? Mountains, forests, rocks, rivers. With what majesty do we there ride above the storms? How sublime to look down into the workhouse of nature, to see her clouds, hail, snow, rain, thunder, all fabricated at our feet, and the glorious sun, when rising as if out of a distant water, just gilding the top of the mountains and giving life to all nature. Those words were written in 1786 to Marie Cosway, his artist friend in England. Now, Jefferson would really get a kick out of this. In addition to his love and knowledge of natural history, he was an expert in archaeology, having supervised the digging of a mound with techniques of recording that were many years ahead of their time. Mr. Jefferson, as he is still known today in the area around Monticello, used many farming methods that were new for his day. These included the rotation of crops and the use of cover crops. And for Jefferson, it sort of come full circle. As the picture showed, they're doing excavations right at his own beloved Monticello. As George Washington, Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson engaged a struggle with an opposing faction led by this man, Alexander Hamilton. That faction wanted the upper class and those with money to rule, and it leaned towards a strong central government and still wanted ties to Great Britain. It favored the merchants and speculators. These were the Federalists, the same ones who wanted to make George Washington the king of the colonies. And I used for the crown that they were going to crown him with a crown from Copenhagen. Thomas Jefferson leaned towards strong states, although he was more an ardent believer in the future of the American Republic than a states' rights advocate. One sure thing, he definitely favored the informed common man, and he wanted the ties to Great Britain cut while maintaining ties to France. These were the Republicans, the forerunner of the present Democratic Party. This same battleground and a few other incidents caused the conflict with his old friend John Adams. This began a bitterness that lasted into their latter years when finally it was healed. As he left the post of Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson wrote these words. And before I give you those words, this is the erection of the White House. His words, "The motion of my blood no longer keeps time with the tumult of the world. It leads me to seek for happiness in the lap and love of my family, in the society of my neighbors and my books, in the wholesome occupations of my farm and my affairs, in an interest or affection in every bud that opens, in every breath that blows around me, in an entire freedom of rest or motion of thought or unthinking, owing account to myself alone of my hours and actions." Monticello was calling him home, and he was quick to yield to the call. Thomas Jefferson became Vice President of the United States under this man, John Adams, and reached another very low point in his life. The Federalists pushed through the Sedition Act, which was aimed at domestic traitors, those who even spoke against the government or its leaders. It was perhaps one of the very worst laws ever passed by the United States Congress. That is to this day. It made a mockery of the Bill of Rights. In Jefferson's words, "The only security of all is in a free press. The force of public opinion cannot be resisted when permitted freely to be expressed. Whenever the people are," those words again, "well informed, they can be trusted with their own government." Now, while serving as vice president, Thomas Jefferson worked on a model of a plow that he was inventing. At least something happened while he was vice president. Most of the time it doesn't. At this time, he also brought the bones of an extinct sloth to Philadelphia. And he developed and wrote a manual of parliamentary practice for the Senate, and that manual is still in use. In 1800, Jefferson, running for president against John Adams, used these famous words, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." He tied with his vice presidential running mate, Aaron Burr, this man, and the House of Representatives had to determine who would be president. Alexander Hamilton, an enemy, nevertheless supported Jefferson over Burr, and thus on the 36th ballot, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States. 3.5 years later, Burr mortally wounded Hamilton in a duel, and this bust of Hamilton is above the Hudson River, and it was down on the land below this bus on the edge of the Hudson River that the duel took place. From Jefferson's first inaugural address, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it." Without pretensions to that high confidence reposed in our first and great revolutionary character, and he's speaking of George Washington, whose preeminent services had entitled him to first place in his country's love and destined for him the fairest page in the volume of faithful history, I ask so much confidence only as may give firmness and effect to the legal administration of your affairs. All of that is from the first inaugural address. And this is James Madison. Then followed a period of 2 terms when the country was in very capable hands, because Jefferson appointed James Madison to the post of Secretary of State and Albert Gallatin to the post of Secretary of Treasury. Besides the President, these were the most important positions in the land. As President of the United States, Jefferson in 1801 sent a naval squadron to Tripoli to stop the Barbary pirates who were attacking U.S. ships. He cut expenditures for the Army and the Navy since the Revolutionary War was over. He also removed the tax on whiskey. This tax had been very unpopular in the West. And the national debt was reduced by 1/3 during his 8 years in office. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to spend a full term in the president's house, later called the White House. John Adams had lived there only 4 months. Jefferson stayed there alone except when daughters Martha and Marie brought their families. This is Martha. And cheer and noise filled the halls. And his daughter Martha Randolph gave birth to the first baby born in the White House. A bright spot for Thomas Jefferson was when Dolly Madison, this lady, acted as hostess. Her husband James was Jefferson's Secretary of State and became the 4th President of the United States. But much of the 8 years was spent with plans for and problems of the nation. He did have a pet mockingbird while in the president's house. He continued to entertain with dinner parties, and his pace of reading did not suffer. But to restore himself, he made numerous trips back home to his beloved Monticello. When you pause and try to absorb the essence of the Lloyd Lilly statue of Thomas Jefferson, which stands in the museum under the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, you might ponder the fact that you are hundreds of miles further west than he ever reached. And yet, his statue is the one that should be the focal point of a museum dedicated to the westward movement. It was his wisdom and abilities combined with some good timing that made possible the mighty expansion of the United States, which we call the Louisiana Purchase. This is a painting of the celebration. He sent James Monroe to Paris to help negotiate the deal. And the deal which was made with Napoleon, whom Thomas Jefferson really hated. For 830,000 square miles, the purchase price was $15 million. And in that same year, 1803, Ohio became a state. And it was Jefferson who sent Lewis and Clark on the expedition called the Voyage of Discovery that even today spells excitement. And the lady sitting between them is Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who guided him. To his aide, Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson gave instructions to get precise knowledge of the Missouri River, get data on soils, plants, minerals, animals, weather, and send back specimens. This is Lewis and Clark meeting the Flathead Indians at Riggs Hole. This was painted by the great Western painter Charlie Russell. And that's some of what they're traversed. This is the Missouri River at Great Falls. That venture told many things about the West that were not known before. Animal skins, antlers, skeletons were among the things sent back. And as I pointed out, a number of the items sent back from that expedition are in Monticello. This is what the falls look like today. And there are some of the specimens in another place in Monticello. Thomas Jefferson brought a profound sense of democracy to the office of president, a very distinct move away from the ways of the Federalists. He reduced formality and protocol. He even decreed that people should sit where they wanted to at state dinners. He used a round table so that no one could sit at the head of it. Sounds like King Arthur there. But his insistence on lavishly entertaining his guests was sending him further into personal debt. Since there was no expense account for the president, Jefferson went $10,000 further into debt during his 2 terms as president. Another contradiction, at Monticello, it was not unusual for him to order 150 bottles of imported wine while almost bankrupt. Even though he did not like institutions, the Military Academy at West Point, New York, was founded in 1802 under his tenure as president. You're looking from the plains or the parade grounds up the Hudson River there. And Thomas Jefferson signed and issued the proclamation for the national road, U.S. Route 40, to be constructed from Cumberland, Maryland to the Ohio country. And of course it was later expanded and expanded from that point. Later Vandalia, Illinois would be the western end for a time. Now that Aaron Burr was displaced on the ticket for Jefferson's second term let me tell you just about this bridge. This is the National Road, and this is a bridge very close to where I took the picture of that proclamation. This is the way they did it. In order that bridges should be as small as possible, they would zigzag the road to get across the bridge, and of course the traffic was very slow, so it didn't really make that much difference. Okay, Aaron Burr was displaced on the ticket for Jefferson's second term, and George Clinton, governor of New York, became vice president. During the second term, Aaron Burr, having lost all power and influence after killing Alexander Hamilton, planned an expedition dealing with Western land and or the taking of Mexico from the Spaniards. They really haven't figured out to this day what he actually intended to do. He involved Harmon Blennerhassett on an island, this one that you're looking at, in the Ohio River in his scheme. And there is the reconstructed house there at Blennerhassett. Burr was brought to trial for treason, but with the aid of Chief Justice John Marshall, who hated Thomas Jefferson, he was acquitted. The Embargo Act was passed in Thomas Jefferson's second term. Its object was the closing of American markets to Great Britain and France, but it hurt the United States more than it hurt them. It was repealed in 1809. Jefferson's library grew to 7,000 volumes. Some people say 10,000, and was sold to the government in 1814 for a rather low price to become the basis of the Library of Congress. The British had destroyed the Library of Congress when they burned the Capitol during the War of 1812, and that's what you're looking at. In a letter to John Adams in 1816, after their years-long feud had been patched up, Thomas Jefferson said, "I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past." A French nobleman had once said of Thomas Jefferson that he had placed his house and his mind on an elevated situation from which he might contemplate the universe. Those two thoughts were now to yield another great work, and this one would be very close to home. Thomas Jefferson would create a great university, the University of Virginia, and that's the Rotunda building. Here's the inside of the upper part. And Thomas Jefferson would consider this his most satisfying achievement of all of those things that he did. He liked this one the best. He drafted the legislation, designed the buildings and campus, influenced the curriculum, and was elected the first rector. And that's the building, and here's where he got some of the ideas. This is the Pantheon in Rome. And remember, he had been over in Europe, and he used some of the ideas from here for the Rotunda. He chose the Pantheon in Rome as his model, which it contains in its dome room, the library. Always with Jefferson, the library. And then out from it is the lawns and the dwelling places and so forth. And you may have known about the serpentine walls. These are some of the quarters for the students, the good students. And here's the serpentine walls. He did a lot of those. Jefferson had fought for free public education, and now he had gone many steps further and created a great university. Quote, "If you expect a people to be ignorant and free, you expect what never was and never will be." That is a statement made by Thomas Jefferson and thought good enough to be quoted by John Kennedy. Remember that Jefferson said that the common man must be informed to be trusted with his own government. Now there was a university to help accomplish that step. This picture is taken from Monticello, and all the way down in Charlottesville you can see the dome of the Rotunda of the University of Virginia. And of the government he could say, "With all the imperfections of our present government, it is without comparison the best existing or that ever did exist." Jefferson's last letter, dated June 24th, 1826, was to the mayor of Washington, D.C. He offered regrets that he could not travel to Washington for the 50th anniversary of Independence Day. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palatable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds of hopes for others. For ourselves, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them. Thomas Jefferson died on the day of celebration, July the 4th, 1826, and just a few hours later, John Adams, second President of the United States, died. Two presidents, both deeply involved with the Declaration of Independence, died on the 50th anniversary of the landmark event. And I have you inside the archives in Washington, D.C. Three memorials illustrate the importance of Thomas Jefferson to the American people. The Jefferson Memorial in Washington is in the nature of a shrine. It was dedicated on April 13, 1943, which was the 200th anniversary of his birth. It is a beautiful building with a larger-than-life stature and a few famous and meaningful quotations on the inside walls. Move out west to Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri. The whole city is named for Thomas Jefferson, and the capital would certainly meet with his approval. Its location on high ground overlooking the Missouri River would be especially pleasing to him, and there is a fine statue of him on the grounds. To gaze and wonder on a bright sunny morning at those giants on Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of South Dakota is to experience a tribute of enormous proportions. And there is Thomas Jefferson, again in a West he never saw. To be on Mount Rushmore is to be honored as few men are, and the honor to Jefferson, as to the other three, is richly deserved. True to his desires, no mention of the presidency was put on his tombstone. The epitaph is just as he wrote it. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statutes of Virginia for Religious Freedom, father of the University of Virginia. May he rest in peace, always.